So I welcome you again to our examination of church history. And we are tonight entering into a period of time which I struggled to find a name for, to be honest with you. There are several different titles that could be used here, and I settled on the golden age of the medieval church. I don't think that's perfect, but it kind of summarizes where we're going to go, and we're going to do a couple of lessons from this period of time because the golden age is going to take a number of discussions to understand. Where we have arrived chronologically is in the middle of the church age in general. Okay, so from Pentecost to the present day, we're right in the middle. But we're also crossing the threshold from the first millennium of the church age into the second millennium of the church age. As you know, we are now in the third millennium of the church age. So we're crossing over that 1,000 year mark into the second half of the medieval church, the second half of the church age in general, and the second millennium of the church age. And as we come to this place, I call it a golden age for a number of reasons, but the primary one is that the church in many ways in the West, the Western church, centered at Rome into Europe, is at this point sort of at its apex in terms of its political power, in terms of its prestige, its wealth, and so forth. This is sort of one of the reasons I call it the golden age, although there's a lot of things that would make it far less than a golden age per se. But nonetheless, it's sort of at the apex of its history. Okay, so let's remind ourselves where we are. When the western side of the empire fell, a great vacuum ensued. Okay, there's no empire there anymore. Now you have all these disparate peoples fighting for position. The church then, in the West, rises up to fill the vacuum. The popes out of Rome become, the bishops to begin with, eventually known as popes, become the key leaders of the Western world at that particular time and create an environment of bringing order out of chaos. In the midst of this world, another empire, a mini empire arises. We call it the Carolingian Empire under Charles the Frank and his predecessors and successors that build a short-lived empire. In fact, even established officially, if you will, by the Pope when Pope Leo put a crown on Charlemagne's head on Christmas Day of 800 and turned that into an official empire, quote unquote, what we call the Holy Roman Empire. And that little empire didn't last very long, okay? So it was only a few hundred years in length. So we get to about 1,000 where we're at. That empire has almost vanished from Europe, and we're back into that chaos mode again. Additionally, as the empire, that Carolingian Empire, is declining, the papacy, the popes and its hierarchy in Rome, is gaining in power and prestige, but at the same time, it's also becoming more and more corrupt. As I pointed out a couple of lessons ago, the various popes during this particular period of time are getting to the seat of Peter by homicide, assassinating their predecessors and taking the position by force. And this has produced all sorts of problems, of course, in the Western Church. And so with the collapse of the Carolingian Empire and the rise of the papacy along with its corruption, the new vacuum that appears now in the West is a desire by the faithful, the true followers of Christ, if you will, to restore or recover a genuine church, a genuine Christianity. So there's a vacuum there that brings about, that desires to have the true church reappear. This thing prior to the turn of the first into the second millennium is corrupt, and many people know it, and they see it, and they want to see renewal. They want to see reform come about. And so there's a mini reformation that takes place right about here. Another particular area of struggle is the monasteries themselves. They too have become corrupt because they became very wealthy by virtue of being the primary landowners. They also found the abbots in these monasteries becoming extremely powerful over the people of the land. And the feudal system allowed them great wealth and great power. And so you see the papacy corrupted, you see the collapse of an empire controlling and controlling chaos, you see the monasteries corrupted. Again, what happens to human societies over time? They corrupt. Okay, they don't work towards greater and greater holiness. They work in the opposite directions because that's entropy, right? Okay, so this is what you have. So it's into this world that this new age, if you will arise as we cross from the first into the second millennium. Okay, and so we'll start with some renewal that starts to take place here. We're going to see the rise here of monastic and papal reforms in the late 10th and early 11th century. So right as we cross that boundary from the 900s into the 1000s, we see the beginnings of these reforms. There are a number of these reforms that take place, but they start in the monasteries. They start in the monasteries. It is the monastic movement in which you see this reform start. Okay, it doesn't start in the papacy. The papacy is a result of the monastery improvements. Many of these monasteries, as I said a minute ago, have become corrupt. They have moved into positions of great power, but they've also abandoned the rule of Benedict. Remember that several lessons ago we talked about that rule which governed the life of a monastery, spiritual focus, work in which you supported yourself with work, teaching, those kinds of things. And even the copying of scripture occurred in these monasteries as well. And so you had in those days, under the rule of Benedict, a strict life of spiritual discipline. That's gone. All right? So the monasteries had fallen away. They'd become much more about property than piety. So there are a number of reformations, the reforms that take place in these monasteries. And there's a lot of details about this. We could talk about the monastery in Cluny, which was where it all started. We could talk about who did that and all that, but that's a lot of detail. Let's just deal with how it sort of came about. One of the first reforms that came, of course, was the general reenactment of the rule in the monasteries. Started in Cluny, in that monastery I mentioned a moment ago, and worked its way out from there into many of these monasteries. Many of these monasteries recaptured this idea of going back to being a place of spiritual discipline. They began to see this. And there were a number of specific people who were involved in causing this. A number of specific men, you might call them reformers, that stepped up and said, we need to recapture the true spiritual discipline of the monastery. But there were a number of other things that had taken place in the church that needed to be addressed, and one of them is something known as simony, S-I-M-O-N-Y, simony. Simony is the buying and selling of ecclesiastical posts. Buying your position. Becoming a bishop because you have enough money and you can buy it. That's called simony. And this had been going on for a number of centuries in the church, that people were buying and selling posts within the church. The popes were able to sell positions and so on based on who had money. And this was one of those things that needed to be dealt with, and they knew it. And so they began to push back against simony. They began to push back against this idea of buying and selling posts along the way. This was a reform pushing towards a view of recapturing the church as an instrument not of political power but of spiritual focus. Okay? These men, these reformers in this period of time said, how can we get the church back to what she's supposed to be? Rather than some political engine wielding power over the masses, how can we make these institutions, the monasteries, the ecclesiastical hierarchies, and even the churches themselves, back into instruments that are dealing with spirituality? And one of the particular things that arose during this period of time as an essence of restoring the spiritual life of these organizations is something called clerical celibacy. The idea of priests and bishops and popes and so forth being celibate, unmarried for the course of their life. The basic idea was, as Paul speaks of in his own writings, the idea that if you are unmarried, you can focus your entire life on the things of God. You don't have to worry about a wife. You don't have to worry about keeping a job so that you can, support your wife and children. If you're celibate, if you have an unmarried position, if you are single. And so what rose up at this particular time was a push for that. Again, we want these men who take on these positions, and women as well. This worked its also way into the nunneries, right? The idea being that these are going to be people who are going to focus their entire attention on spiritual matters, not on the things of this world. And so this was the beginning of a time in which clerical celibacy became something at the very essence of Reformation. Now, we're 1,000 years removed from this, right? And today we would look at clerical celibacy in the 20th century and say, yeah, but the unintended consequences of that are significant. First of all, there's no biblical support for it. But secondly, it comes with all sorts of unintended consequences. I mean, during the 20th century, where you have a massive sexual revolution taking place in Western culture, the result of that becomes a massive scandal, sexual scandal, amongst the celibate. So one of the unintended consequences of that shows up now, 1,000 years later. I would argue it shows up much earlier than this, but we see it now. So we look back on this idea of clerical celibacy and say, well, that's a stupid idea. But it really wasn't in that day. Okay? In all fairness, in that day, the push to clerical celibacy was being pushed by men who were trying to recapture the essence of a true spiritual life in the life of the church. That men and women who are devoted to God and are in the position of advancing the cause of Christ through the preaching of the gospel, the practice of the sacraments, and all the other things that go on in the spiritual life of the church, we want those men and women dedicated to that. And so clerical celibacy at the time was an appropriate conservative response to the corruption of the church. And so we need to be careful. We look back at this and say, well, that was dumb, but not really. It actually had its purpose and its intention in that time, and it was motivated in the right sort of way. I think there would have been other better solutions, as we'll discover when we get to the Reformation, but the bottom line is this was one of the things that was being pushed. A fourth reform was the push towards the centrality of papal obedience, the need for the masses to obey the Pope, to come under his authority instead of all of the ecclesiastical issues being spread out among so many different men trying to make decisions on their own. This guy believes this and this guy believes that, to try to centralize power. Again, we would look at that and say that's a really foolish idea. But in that day, it was being pushed by men trying to bring together the church in some way. And then, of course, the final issue is the issue of wealth. I mean, what do you do with all of this massive wealth that the church possesses in the monasteries, in the church itself, in the papacy? How do we reform all of that? And the intention was to try to return the monasteries to their piety by returning land to people, but it was this particular attempt at reform which was the largest failure. And one of the reasons why this Reformation found itself being very short-lived. Because the massive amounts of wealth that the church in the West was able to accumulate to itself doomed most of these monastic reforms. Now, I bring that up because that is going to be the backdrop to the few things we're going to continue in this discussion. All right, so I want you to keep in your mind that all of what we're about to talk about flows out of this feeling in this time of a desire to reform the church and recapture a good spiritual existence in the church, okay? You see where I'm at now. In other words, this is the thinking. The primary impetus here is, how do we recover the true church, okay? And there are a number of things that will flow out of this reform movement, and you'll see the impact. The first of these is a clash that occurs between the papacy and the empire. Because, now when I say empire, I mean what's left of the Carolingian Empire that's still sort of hanging around in Europe. Okay, as I said, it doesn't last very long, but at its tail end, there's a clash that occurs between the popes and the emperor, and the primary issue is between a man by the name of Pope Gregory VII and an emperor by the name of Henry IV. These two men clash, and guess what they clash over? They clash over the issue of ecclesiastical reform. The Pope is driving through a couple of his men. I mentioned their names a few lessons ago, Hildebrand and Humbert, who were two men who had come with the intention of reforming the ecclesiastical posts. In fact, Pope Gregory VII had only taken the papacy because he was elected to it. He didn't want to just get it. He wanted the people to actually want him. And he went head to head with the emperor. He was a reformer. He wanted to see ecclesiastical reform, but he went up against the emperor because the emperor wanted to still have the power to appoint bishops or depose bishops that were loyal to his empire. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if you're the emperor, you want to be able to have the power to depose or appoint people who are controlling other forms of power, like land and so forth. So he still wanted to have that. Gregory insisted on this program of reformation, but Henry insisted the emperor should still be allowed to appoint bishops. So when Henry deposed a bishop, Gregory ordered him to Rome. The Pope said, "You come, and you will answer to me." But a military contingent sent by the emperor attacked Pope Gregory on Christmas Eve 1075, and Henry the emperor declared him deposed from his position as pope. Gregory was for a brief time imprisoned, was freed, and then in his imprisonment declared that Henry the emperor was under interdict, which is a complicated way of saying that he was subject to eternal discipline. You might say the Pope revoked his salvation. Okay? So the Pope declared that Henry the fourth Henry IV was now under interdict. So Henry went to Canossa to appeal Gregory's sentence, and he had to beg to come in to the castle for 3 days. He had to stand outside and beg. But he was eventually forgiven by the Pope. But it is this event that began a series of disputes between the crown on the one hand and the Pope on the other. And eventually the reforming popes prevailed. Clerical celibacy became universal in the West. Simony died down, at least for a while. It always comes back, of course. And the power of the papacy continued to grow until it reached its apex in the 13th century. So this reform movement has its first clash with the very empire it itself had created. Okay? But there's a second effect that this reform has, and it's in something we call the Great Schism of 1054. As you know, at this point in church history, at the close of the first millennium, beginning of the second millennium, there is a single church still, a Catholic church with a lowercase c, a universal church, that has two basic fronts. The church in the West, centered in Rome, under the Bishop of Rome, otherwise known as the Pope, and the church in the East, centered at Constantinople, under the Patriarch of the East. So you have a church still unified, with two separate locations, if you will, but they are growing apart, and they're growing apart rapidly. And it is this Reformation action in the western side of the empire that actually causes these two churches to split apart finally into two completely separate units. And the issue was the issue of clerical celibacy. The East refused to embrace the idea of clerical celibacy. a couple of secondary matters that went along with it was that the church in the West insisted that the bread in communion had to be unleavened. Again, that's a part of the dogma of transubstantiation, all right? And they also insisted that the Nicene Creed also must include the statement, "and from the Son," in the statement that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. That's known as the Philoquy, that final part there that the West insisted must be added to the Nicene Creed in regards to the nature of the Spirit. The East said, no, the Spirit only proceeds from the Father. The Father sends the Son, and the Father sends the Spirit. The West said, no, Jesus was clear when he said, I will ask the Father, and he will send the Spirit. And then later Jesus said, I will send the Spirit. And the West said, see, that's an indication that in the Trinitarian view, both the Father and the Son are sending the Spirit into the world. The East denied that, okay? But it was this issue of clerical celibacy that really brought it up. Pope Leo sent Cardinal Humbert, I mentioned his name a little while ago, his legate, to deal with the issue. Went to the East. He went to Constantinople. He was one of these very zealous reformers. He believed in clerical celibacy. He believed that simony should be done away with. He believed that the Pope should be the guy that everybody submits to because he's the guy that can unify the church as a single voice around the world. And so the East should get on board with what's going on with the West. And so he traveled to Constantinople. He despised the married status of the clergy in the East, and he particularly despised the authority of the Byzantine emperor over the church in the East. You see, all of those things I talked about, that clash between the church and the emperor in the West spills over now into Humbert going to Constantinople and looking at everything that the East believes and saying, you guys need to submit yourself to the Pope and acquiesce to us. On June the 16th of 1054, when Patriarch Michael I was about to celebrate communion at the Hagia Sophia, Humbert barged in to the worship service, declared the Patriarch and his followers excommunicated, shook the dust from his feet, and walked out. Thus, the split between the East and the West was complete. Because I can assure you that the Patriarch of the East did not accept the excommunication of the legate of Pope Leo. They said, forget it. And now you have, from 1054 to today, from June the 16th, 1054 to today, two distinct sides of the church, each going their separate ways and have been now for almost 1,000 years. It's interesting, I had the chance to visit the Hagia Sophia when I was in Turkey, and we talked about this event, that this was the place where the church was split east from west. But you will notice what precipitated it. What precipitated it was a zeal in the West to restore the church to her glory and to her magnificence, to get rid of these human issues related to spiritual life and political life. And some of these men were a little overzealous, and it produced comical side effects. Which leads to something else that also comes. The zealousness of this desire to reform spilled over into another aspect of the history of the Christian church. Of the two most darkest hours of the history of the church, this is one of them. And this is what we call the Crusades. The other darkest one, of course, would be the Inquisition. Now, when we talk about the Crusades, I want to talk about it in sections, okay? But remember, from the start, the Crusades are flowing out of this zeal in the West, in Europe, to restore the church to her glory, to bring the Christian church back. All right? So there were a number of goals that were romanticized into the Crusades. A number of things that the people of Europe in these times, including many of these great reformers, thought we can do this. Okay? There were a number of goals in the Crusades. Now let me tell you what the Crusades are. The Crusades are an attempt by the West to recapture specific lands taken by the Muslims. You remember, some time ago we talked about how Islam rose out of Arabia and came and sacked and took control of a great portion of the Eastern Empire. It did not sack Constantinople, but it pushed the empire back into Asia Minor around Istanbul, and then took control of Syria, and then south to Jerusalem, into Palestine, around into Egypt, and across the northern side of the African peninsula, and then even across the Straits of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. So it hooked around all the way from Constantinople to Syria, Palestine, across North Africa, through Egypt and Carthage, up the Straits of Gibraltar and into Spain, where it was eventually stopped. All of this territory then around the Mediterranean is in Islamic control. You remember I pointed out a couple of weeks ago that many of the primary centers of Christian thinking at the time are now in Muslim control. Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch, Egypt, right? Hippo, Carthage, and even most of Spain is under Muslim control at this point. Okay. North into Europe is not, of course, and Asia Minor and east into the Balkans is not, but nonetheless, around the Mediterranean basin. So guess what the Europeans want to do? They want to go back and get those lands back. And what's the one place that they really want to get more than any other? They really want to wrestle back from the Muslims. Jerusalem. Correct. So these are some of the goals then that are romanticized in the Crusades. Number one, to save the Byzantine Empire from the Muslim incursions into Constantinople. To save the empire. The empire, you remember, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire, survives until only the 15th century. It's also to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. The Great Schism of 1054 needs to be healed. Can't have two churches. We need one central church under the Pope in the West. The way to do that, go and recapture the Muslim lands in the hope of reuniting the West and the East. That did, by the way, occur very briefly, but the result was even greater suspicion and hatred over time. Thirdly, obviously, to retake the Holy Lands from the Muslims. And then fourthly, part of the romance of the Crusades was even this idea of going on jihad, Christian jihad, in order even to achieve heaven itself. Okay? To go and do these things in order to say, look, I've given myself fully to the things of God, and therefore I'm going to go and try to take back Jerusalem, and that's going to guarantee me heaven. Now, make no mistake about it, there's a great deal of mysticism and superstition that's involved in all of this, and I'll talk about that as we close. The impetus of the First Crusade then, is the Muslim control of the Holy Lands, and they curtailed pilgrimages to its holy places. They stopped allowing Christians to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. Couldn't go to Bethlehem anymore. Couldn't go to Jerusalem and see the Temple Mount. Couldn't go and see the places where Jesus went, okay? And that was something that Christians, of course, despise, obviously. But what we see happen in Asia Minor, particularly to the east of east of Asia Minor, is the rise of the Seljuk Turks, who have now been converted to Islam, and they are beginning to threaten the Byzantine Empire across Asia Minor. There were also a number of economic hardships that occurred throughout Europe. There was a massive amount of famine and disease running through Europe during this time. This was not a time of great prosperity. In fact, quite the opposite. There were a number of epidemics, what today we would call pandemics, but in those days would be known as epidemics, that swept through Europe during these days. And the loss of life and famine and crop failures and all sorts of other things pushed people to do some things they ought not to do. It was refueled by the apocalyptic dreams of earlier centuries as soldiers of Christ. But what really began the First Crusade was a call by the Byzantine Emperor Alexis I to Pope Urban II in Rome for support against these Turks. They called a council at Clermont in 1095, and they walked out of that council with the cry of Deus vult, God wills it. God wills it. This is what God has willed, that we should go and take back the lands that rightly belong to us. So, the precursor to the First Crusade then, even before this council, was a disorganized mob that left from Cologne for Jerusalem under a man by the name of Peter the Hermit. They traveled from France across Europe to the south and east, moving their way towards Constantinople. And as they did, they went through lands that were, at this time, of course, owned by Western Christians. And they forcibly took their provisions from these people and even went so far as to kill many Jews along the way. The zeal of this Reformation, quote unquote, that had taken hold of these people in these hard times were to blame the Jews for much of this. Not new, of course. And so they found themselves moving across Europe from the west to the east and to the south. But most of the people in this initial movement out from Cologne died before reaching Constantinople. Disease, fights with the locals, and many other things caused many of them to never even make it to Constantinople. The rest, once they got there, did join the official crusade that began from there. It set out led by a man by the name of Edhemar, Bishop of Puy, Urban II's personal representative. And he led a crusade of Christians from Constantinople, south and east through Asia Minor, to a place called Antioch. You may be familiar with that name because it's found in the early chapters of the book of Acts. You remember that the city of Antioch is north of Jerusalem, near the Syrian border, which became the center of the church during the earliest years of the Christian faith. You remember that Paul and Barnabas were sent out from the church at Antioch on their first missionary journey. The church had left Jerusalem and moved north to Antioch and was centered there for some time during the early time. Well, the Christians show up again at Antioch to retake it. They first managed to take Nicaea, which is just south and east of Constantinople. You remember where that first ecumenical council was held. They managed to take that place first. Then they continued their march south and east across Syria and down to Antioch. And they moved in that place. The Byzantines entered first to retain it for themselves. They then struggled through the mountains of Asia Minor and various Muslim outposts before arriving in Antioch. Now, the siege of the city of Antioch was difficult. The city had more supplies than attackers, and the Crusaders had many desertions. But someone on the inside who was a Christian let them in. Someone opened the gate somewhere, and they got in, and the Crusaders found themselves then inside the city. But a brigade of Muslim soldiers arrived after they had come into the city. They were attempting to take the citadel of the city when they got inside, and then found themselves surrounded inside the city by a Muslim army that had come to protect the city. Someone inside the city claimed that he had had a vision of the lance, the holy lance, that had been used to spear Jesus in the side. Somebody in the city claimed that they had seen a vision of this and knew where it was. It was in the city. And they went to a place and they dug in the ground, and sure enough, guess what they found? They found a spear in the ground. Now, you and I all know, of course, that somebody buried it there and then turned around and said that they knew where it was. But superstition was running high, especially when you're surrounded by a Muslim army outside. Your life is very much in danger. From this event, then, they managed to build up this great zeal in this. Convinced it was real, they fasted and prayed for 5 days and were possessed of such zeal that the Turkish army around the city broke and ran. They actually scared the army off and kept the city. They then continued south through Palestine to Jerusalem, arriving there on June the 7th of 1099. Both sides in the city were prepared for a long siege, but hearing that a large army was approaching, the Crusaders decided, let's do what they did in Jericho. They marched around the city several times and then attacked, breaching the wall and taking it on July the 15th of 1099. So this crusade went from a little ragtag group that started off in Cologne in France, worked its way to Constantinople, where it joined a more official group of Christians going out from there who went down to Nicaea and took it, then went down to Antioch and took it, and then went south to Jerusalem and took it away from the Muslims. The Crusaders then reorganized the conquered lands under their leaders, each taking titles like King of Jerusalem, but their ability to hold these places was short-lived. The Muslims came back. So the first crusade that I just mentioned here is the only official crusade, the only one established as a crusade by the emperor and the pope together. But there were a number of others that took place afterwards. They were much more informal. This crusading spirit lingered for a long time, in fact, for centuries. And various mobs would rise up to march to the Holy Lands under the fierce preaching of conquest. It would be men who would go into their pulpits and preach that we need to retake these lands and we can do this under the power of God, and God has given us a mission, and there are a number of men who preached in such ways. In fact, there was even a children's crusade that started off in Europe, sent thousands of children south to go and crusade. Most of them died along the way or were enslaved by the people that they came across in this way. So there's a zeal here that's not rational in many ways. The Second Crusade was precipitated by the fall of Edessa in 1144 to the Sultan Aleppo. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany led an army of 200,000 to retake Edessa, but they were defeated by the Turks and accomplished little. The Third Crusade was precipitated by the retaking of Jerusalem in 1187 by Saladin, Sultan of Egypt. Pope Clement III called for a new crusade, which was led by Emperor Barbarossa, Richard the Lionhearted of England, and Philip II of France. It was a dismal failure, even resulting in Richard's capture by Germany for a massive ransom. The Fourth Crusade was precipitated by the preaching of Fouquet de Neuilly, I think that's how you pronounce it, Fouquet de Neuilly, against the injustice of the poor versus the rich. He was concerned about the fact that the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and so what do we need to do? We need to go take back Jerusalem. Attacked Saladin in Egypt. He was charged by the Pope with raising an army, which he did. And on their way, they were convinced to go to Constantinople instead, due to a rivalry over the Eastern throne. The city was retaken. The city of Jerusalem was retaken, and a Latin emperor and patriarch were named. So there was a short period of time of something which we call the Latin Empire in the east, but the Byzantines resisted until 1261, when the Empire of Nicaea retook Constantinople. There were 4 more Crusades after that. They accomplished little, and the whole crusading thing ended by about 1270 AD. So you'll notice it's from about the middle to late part of the 11th century until about the 13th century. So it's a short little window of a few hundred years of time. There was another significant crusade that took place, however, and it occurred on the Iberian Peninsula when the Christians in Spain rose up against the Muslims in that place. The rise of the ancient Visigothic kingdom of Spain against the Muslims occurred starting around 1031. And they continually fought against the Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula until 1248, with the final recapturing of the peninsula by the Christians in 1492. Know that date? Mhm. Now, as you can see, there was a great zeal that took place, which started with a zeal to reform the church herself, and that zeal turned into an irrational zeal to go out and even try to recapture lands that had been taken by the Muslims. A combination of all kinds of things worked together. You see it? You see the reforming zeal of leadership in the church itself, the reforming zeal of men in the monasteries trying to restore the church there, which then spills out from the monasteries and the ecclesiastical hierarchy into the population. You couple that with all kinds of political issues and political problems, a clash between the church and the empire. And then you also have just the day-to-day realities of living in a place where you have famine and pestilence and plague and all kinds of other things that makes men rise up and do strange things. And this culminates, of course, with a movement in an attempt to try to recapture lands when these people had no ability really to do so, and there's no impetus or reason, I should say, for them to do so. But the period of the Crusades, this little 200-year window of time, had some lasting effects. And this is the point we're making. First, the Crusades attempted to restore the break between the East and the West. Those two churches, those two sides of the church, I should say, have been growing apart for a long time. It comes to a head in 1054. But there was still a desire by both sides of the empire, I think, or both sides of the church, I should say, to try to restore that back to a single church, especially in the West, because the popes believed, as I mentioned, that they were the head of the church, and they believed that they should bring the eastern side of the empire. And so the idea of the Crusades was to try to go to Constantinople and win over the people on the east through a military campaign in Jerusalem that would ultimately convince them that they need to bring themselves under the papacy. But guess what it wound up doing? It wound up making the split even more, not less. It brought far more enmity between the West and the East. And that enmity exists even to today. In fact, I don't remember this, Perry, but there was do you remember under John Paul II that there was an attempt by John Paul to reach out to the Patriarch of the Eastern Church? And I don't remember his name, I forget his name, but I remember it distinctly that they wanted to meet, and the Patriarch from the East said, forget it, I'm not coming to visit. Remember, Pope John Paul II, I think, had invited him to come to the Vatican, and he had refused to do so. That enmity still exists even to today. Those two churches and the two heads of those churches say, we have nothing to do with one another. In fact, now what we have is that the Eastern Church, Eastern Orthodoxy, looks at Roman Catholicism and sees it as utterly and completely corrupt and says, we will have nothing to do with you, which is the reason why the Patriarch of the East wouldn't have anything to do with John Paul II. Patriarch of the East would probably say, I can't quote him exactly, but I bet he would say something to the effect of, well, you're now worshiping Mary. What in the world does that have to do with Christianity? So this enmity that began long before 1054, was codified in 1054, only grew wider as a result of the Crusades. But it also increased, obviously, the enmity between Islam and Christianity. Now Christianity and Islam were no longer able to tolerate one another. Up until this point, there's been a sense in which you could live in a Muslim land as a Christian, practice your Christianity, and not have to worry about the Muslims coming and arresting you and taking you to jail. Well, guess what? After the Crusades, that was gone. Now the Muslims would employ their law upon the land, and Christians would be expelled or destroyed in those lands. Which is, by the way, the reason why it took so long for the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula to actually take hold, because it would require the Christians to literally drive the Muslims out. Because the Muslims would keep trying to reimpose Sharia law over the land and say, you can't be a Christian here, and the Christians will have to literally push them out. And that enmity, of course, continues to today. Another effect of the Crusades was, in fact, ironically, an enhanced power of the papacy, especially internationally. It is from these days of the Crusades that the Pope can speak as an international leader. Does not the popes in the Vatican speak as though they have authority over the presidents and kings and queens of other nations? Does not certain presidents and so forth listen with a certain amount of deference to the man in the Vatican, even to today? Absolutely. They were the ones who called for the Crusades. They were the ones who appointed its leaders. They were the ones who defined its holy purpose. And the papacy, surprisingly, in an age of reformation, of trying to restore the church to a place of spiritual, back to its spiritual health, the result is that the Pope becomes even more powerful in the midst of all of it. The unintended consequence of that is not to actually create a papacy that answers to the people, which is what Bruno wanted when he became Pope, but rather quite the opposite. How many of you get a vote in who's the Pope? Or better, Perry, how many Catholics sitting in Catholic churches get a vote in who the Pope is? And the answer is none. Zero. All the authority rests in the hierarchy at the top, period, end of sentence. But, as I alluded to a minute ago, something else arises in this period of time, okay? This soup in this time, this historical soup of ecclesiastical reform coupled with famine and pestilence and so forth, hunger, difficulty, hardship, poverty, where the church has massive resources at its disposal, but it's not actually doing anything for the poor itself. The result of this is a massive increase in mysticism in the church in the West. A massive increase of mysticism in Christianity. Increased contacts with the Holy Land increased people's attention to Jesus' physicality, which produced the veneration of relics streaming into Europe. Go to Jerusalem, find the place where Jesus was born, take a piece of the wood, bring it back and say, hey, this is a chunk of the very manger that Jesus slept in, and everybody bows down and worships it. The veneration of relics becomes a key part of the Western idea of Christianity, even to today. Even to today, you can go to places in Europe where apparently you can find a piece of the very cross that Christ was crucified on, and you can have a mass said there, and you can venerate that particular object. This mysticism rises up. Catholicism, Western Christianity is deeply mystical. Deeply. In fact, Perry and I could tell you war stories of the kinds of things that we were taught to believe about objects in the course of our early lives. There was also, during this time, strangely enough, again, even in the midst of reform, the rise of certain monastic military orders, where from the monasteries, military guerrilla forces arose. The Templars of Jerusalem, for example, are the direct descendants of a group of people coming out of the monasteries who developed a militaristic sense of, we're going to set up ourselves as soldiers of Christ, and we're going to go out in the world and conquer it. If you saw the movie with Tom Hanks by Dan Brown, what's the name of that? Da Vinci Code. It's based on this idea. A militaristic sense in Christianity, which was born during this day. In fact, the use of force by Innocent III in 1209 against the Bogomils in South France is probably one of the greatest examples of it, but by clearly the greatest example of this is the Inquisition. The Inquisition, which we'll get to. We also find that in the West, during this period of time, there's an introduction of a massive amount of Muslim and Jewish philosophical works into Western Europe. That will have long-term effect over time. But probably the single greatest thing that occurs during this particular period of time, not that any of these aren't great, but this is one that really comes to play at this time, is the economic and demographic conversion from the barter system to the monetary system that we use today. Instead of going down to your local store and giving them a chicken for a loaf of bread, you now give them a piece of money that has been printed by the state as legal tender. It starts here. This is when the idea of the poverty that exists doesn't give people the ability to barter, and so a new system has to be developed in order to actually buy and sell, and the monetary system appears in Europe during this particular period of time. It creates an entirely new system of trade. It overthrows the entirety of the old nobility system in Europe. The only place that it really lasts is in the various monarchies that continue in the West. For example, the monarchies in Britain and France will both have a certain amount of nobility. I mean, if you watch Downton Abbey, you know that there's such a thing as lords and ladies and earls and so forth, right? That continues for a great deal of time, long into the process. But the bottom line is it's ultimately the destruction of the nobility that comes by virtue. If you're no longer defining your wealth by what you own, but rather defining your wealth by money, changes everything, doesn't it? Changes it dramatically. And it creates the rise of great cities where the bourgeoisie will live and will even increase the divide between the rich and the poor during this period of time. All of these things can be traced to that Reformation zeal that started up as the Carolingian Empire collapses, and a new fervor arises in Europe to try to restore Christianity to what it's supposed to be. And that's the effect of it. The unintended consequences of that zeal, as pure as it might have been in the original men's minds, turns out to actually do the opposite, which I think just has God laughing from his throne, to be honest with you. Because the foolishness of men is this. All right, so this is the first part of the golden age of the empire. And you'll notice I struggle with the term golden age because it doesn't look like a golden age, but it's a golden age in the sense that there are men on the continent who really want to restore Christianity and the church to what it's supposed to be. So in a sense, it's a golden age by virtue of the fact that you have this massive move of Reformation. But it's not a theological Reformation, it's a political and economic one, which is under the guise of a spiritual Reformation. So it's nothing like the Reformation of the 15th century. First of all, it's encapsulated within the church and never escapes from the church like the 16th century one does. And secondly, it has all kinds of side effects which actually make the church far worse than what she was to begin with. Okay? So this is the beginning, if you will, of a golden age. As I said, the papacy rises to its apex here in about the 13th century, or 14th centuries, the 1300s. And so we're still not quite yet to the place where the church is this grand thing yet, but we're almost there in this way. Do you have any questions? That's later. Now, we've already seen snippets of this idea that the Pope is infallible when he speaks, okay? So there's already been a movement in that direction. It doesn't get codified really until a little later. But I would venture to guess that Urban II would probably say, yeah, when I speak, you ought to listen. Because that's what he said through his legate to the Patriarch and Hagia Sophia, right? I have spoken. Again, a lot of these dogmas develop over time. And we're talking about centuries of time here, so not overnight. All right, so that's where we are as we cross into the second millennium of the church age, the second millennium of our time, and Lord willing, in 2 weeks we will look at the Golden Age again. Brian Roden is going to bring a lesson next week on the dissemination of Scripture, so you might want to be here for that. And so looking forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks.